All right, let's go. Number 10. The ghost population. The humans who existed and left no bones. In 2020, a team led by Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman at UCLA published a paper in Science Advances that identified something in the genomes of modern West African populations that should not have been there. Genetic signatures from an archaic human lineage never found in any fossil, from any excavation, at any site on Earth. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, something else. A population that interbred with the ancestors of modern West Africans approximately 50,000 years ago, contributed an estimated 2 to 19% of the DNA of some modern populations, and left no physical trace in the archaeological record that has yet been identified. The researchers called it a ghost population. But here is where this changes the entire framework of human evolution. The standard model of human prehistory is built on fossils and artifacts. What you find in the ground is what existed. The ghost population proves this assumption is wrong. A population significant enough to leave a genetic legacy in tens of millions of living people left no skeletal remains in over a century of African archaeological excavation. If one ghost population exists, others almost certainly do. The current genetic databases cover only a fraction of modern human diversity. The African continent, where the vast majority of human evolutionary history occurred, is also the continent with the least coverage in ancient DNA studies. There are people alive today carrying the DNA of a species we have not found. The ghost is not in the past, it is in the present, in living people, in sequenced genomes, pointing back 50,000 years to an encounter with something we cannot yet name.
Number 9. The Yamnaya expansion. The people who replaced Europe's population in 500 years. In 2015, two papers published simultaneously in Nature, one led by Wolfgang Hack at the Max Planck Institute, one led by David Reich at Harvard, fundamentally altered the accepted history of European prehistory. Beginning approximately 5,000 years ago, pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea in modern Ukraine and Russia, expanded westward into Europe. Within approximately 500 years, they had replaced up to 75% of the genetic ancestry of populations across northern and central Europe. The farmers who had been living in Europe for 3,000 years, who built the megalithic monuments, who were there when Stonehenge's first phase was constructed, were genetically replaced within a period shorter than the time between the founding of Rome and today. But here is where the finding forces an uncomfortable question. The genetic replacement is documented.
What caused it is not agreed upon. The Yamnaya were not a documented military empire. There are no mass graves from this period explaining the scale of demographic change. Disease is the leading hypothesis. The Yamnaya may have carried pathogens against which established European farming populations had no immunity, in a dynamic analogous to what happened in the Americas 5,000 years later. If correct, the first demographic catastrophe in European history, a 75% population replacement across an entire continent, happened before anyone had a writing system to record it. If you are of European descent, you are statistically likely to carry Yamnaya ancestry. The people who replaced 3/4 of your ancestors arrived from the steppe 5,000 years ago and left no account of what they did or how they did it. Number 8. Ancient Egyptian DNA, the finding that changed a civilization's origin story. In 2017, Johannes Krause and Wolfgang Hack at the Max Planck Institute published the first successful genome-wide analysis of ancient Egyptian remains in Nature Communications, using mummies from the site of Abu Sir el-Malik, spanning the New Kingdom, Late Period, and Ptolemaic periods, approximately 1400 BCE to 400 CE. The findings. Ancient Egyptians in this period shared the greatest genetic similarity with ancient populations of the Levant and Anatolia, the Near East, with minimal genetic contribution from sub-Saharan African populations. Modern Egyptians show significantly more sub-Saharan African ancestry than ancient Egyptians, a difference that increased in the post-Roman period. But here is where the finding opens more questions than it resolves. The samples came from a single site across a narrow time window.
Ancient Egypt existed as a unified state for over 3,000 years across a territory spanning from the Nile Delta to modern Sudan. The genetic profile of a Ptolemaic mummy may differ substantially from the people who built the Great Pyramid 1,500 years earlier, or from the Nubian dynasties that ruled Egypt in the 25th dynasty. The 2017 paper was a beginning, not a conclusion. What it demonstrated is that ancient Egyptian origins cannot be answered by a single political narrative. That the population of the Nile Valley changed across 3,000 years of history in ways that require decades more of sampling to understand. Ancient Egypt is 3,000 years of history. We have genetically sampled a few decades of it from one location. The rest is still in the ground. Number 7. The Tarim Basin Mummies. Western Faces and the Heart of China. The Tarim Basin of what is now China's Xinjiang region is one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. A desert surrounded by mountain ranges, summer temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius, winters below -30. Beginning in the 1980s, archaeologists recovered naturally mummified human remains from sites including Shaohe and Ka Regul, dated to between 4,000 and 2,000 years before present. The mummies were preserved by extreme aridity. The physical appearance was not what the location predicted. Light-colored hair, tall stature, woven plaid textiles and patterns associated with the Caucasus. When ancient DNA analysis was published by Chunwan Zhang and colleagues in Nature in 2021, it confirmed what the physical evidence suggested: zero detectable East Asian ancestry. The individuals were genetically related to an ancient North Eurasian lineage, most closely associated with populations from the Eurasian steppe and Western Europe. But here is where the finding rewrites a specific history. The Tarim Basin sits at the geographic center of the Silk Road, the network that transmitted Buddhism, silk production, and gunpowder between civilizations. The mummies predate the formal Silk Road by over 1,000 years. They are evidence that exchange across Central Asia began not in the first millennium BCE, but at least 4,000 years ago. The genetic analysis also showed these were not recent migrants. They were an isolated population, with no significant migration into or out of the group for centuries. They had been there long enough to become genetically distinct. The Tarim Basin mummies are in the Xinjiang Museum in Urumqi. Their faces, preserved by the desert, look directly at you across 4,000 years from the geographical heart of Asia. Number 6. Otzi the Iceman, the most completely understood prehistoric human and his unsolved murder. On September 19, 1991, tourists found a human body emerging from glacier ice in the Alps near the Austrian-Italian border. Initially thought to be a recent accident victim, eventually dated to approximately 3,300 BCE, the oldest naturally preserved human body in Europe. His genome, sequenced by Albert Zink and colleagues at the Urac Research Institute, revealed brown eyes, not the blue initially reconstructed in museum displays, lactose intolerant, type O blood, significant atherosclerosis confirmed in his arteries, approximately 45 to 50 years old. His Y chromosome haplogroup is now found primarily in Sardinia and Corsica, rare across mainland Europe. But here is where a 5,300-year-old murder case remains open. Otzi was not killed by the cold. An arrowhead is lodged in his left shoulder, striking the subclavian artery. His hands show defensive wounds, cuts consistent with grabbing a blade. His last meal, consumed 30 to 60 minutes before death, included ibex meat, red deer, einkorn wheat, and plants. He climbed to 3,210 meters and was killed there. We know what he ate for his last meal. We know he had heart disease. We know someone chased him up a mountain and shot him with an arrow. The murderer's DNA has not been found at the scene. Otzi is in a refrigerated display in the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano. His genome is publicly accessible. He is the most completely understood prehistoric individual who ever lived, and his killer has been unidentified for 5,300 years. Number 5. Cheddar Man. What the oldest Briton actually looked like. In 1903, a complete human skeleton was discovered in Gough's Cave in Somerset, England. The individual, a young male who died in his mid-20s, dated to approximately 10,000 years before present, the oldest near-complete human skeleton found in Britain. For most of the 20th century, Cheddar Man was reconstructed with light skin, a standard assumption for remains from Western Europe, based on the presumed link between northern latitude and pale skin adaptation. In 2018, a team from University College London and the Natural History Museum published full genome sequencing. The result overturned the reconstruction. Cheddar Man had dark to very dark skin, blue eyes, and dark curly hair.
But here's where the finding carries implications beyond one individual's appearance. Cheddar Man belonged to the Western hunter-gatherer population, the people of Europe after the last ice age, before farming arrived. The genetic variants associated with light skin in modern Europeans had not yet been introduced into European populations. They arrived later, with Anatolian farmers approximately 6,000 years ago, and with Yamnaya pastoralists from the steppe. Light skin in Europe is not ancient. The people who built the megalithic monuments, who painted the cave walls, who hunted megafauna across post-glacial Europe, would have looked profoundly different from the standard reconstructions in most museums. Cheddar Man is in the Natural History Museum in London. The reconstruction generated from his genome surprised almost everyone who saw it, including the scientists who produced it.
Number 4. The Paleo-Eskimo Replacement. Two populations who never interbred. For approximately 4,500 years, beginning around 2500 BCE, the Paleo-Eskimos, the people of the pre-Dorset and Dorset cultures, inhabited the Arctic regions of Canada and Greenland with extraordinary sophistication, developing the tools and techniques that allowed survival in one of Earth's most extreme environments. Then approximately 700 CE, the Thule arrived from Alaska, ancestors of modern Inuit, with larger boats, dog sleds, and open-water whaling capability that Dorset technology could not match. Within approximately 200 years, the Paleo-Eskimos had vanished from the archaeological record. In 2014, ancient DNA analysis published in Science by Eske Willerslev's team produced a finding with no parallel in the global record of human population contact. Zero detectable interbreeding between the Paleo-Eskimos and the Thule across potentially centuries of contact and eventual replacement.
But here is where the absence of interbreeding forces a question with no comfortable answer. Every other documented case of population contact in the ancient DNA record shows interbreeding. Modern humans and Neanderthals, different species, interbred. The Yamnaya, who replaced European farmers, interbred with them before replacing them. There is no other case of two modern human populations in geographic proximity for an extended period with zero genetic exchange. The mechanism that kept these populations isolated, cultural taboo, active avoidance, disease asymmetry, is unknown. The Paleo-Eskimos were replaced by a population they apparently never mixed with. Their genetic lineage is absent from every living person on Earth.
Number 3. Ancient Plague, DIN. The pathogen that is 3,000 years older than we thought. The Black Death of the 14th century killed an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population. The history of its causative agent, Yersinia pestis, was assumed to extend back to the Justinianic plague of the 6th century CE, the first pandemic clearly identifiable as plague in the documentary record. In 2015, a team led by Eske Willerslev published ancient DIN analysis of Yersinia pestis recovered from skeletal remains across Eurasia. The oldest samples dated to approximately 3000 BCE, placing the origin of plague 3,000 years earlier than the first documented pandemic, and contemporaneous with the Bronze Age Yamnaya expansion. The ancient strains were different from the medieval Black Death variant. They lacked the genes associated with flea-borne transmission that made the medieval strain so efficient. Early strains appear to have spread through direct contact or respiratory routes.
But here is where the timeline produces an implication that has not been widely discussed. The Yamnaya expansion, the 75% population replacement of Europe, and the emergence of ancient plague strains occur in the same period. If the Yamnaya carried early plague strains to which they had developed some resistance, and the established European farming populations had not, a disease-based explanation for the demographic replacement gains specific biological support. The plague that killed a third of Europe in the 14th century may have had a precursor 4,000 years earlier. And that earlier event may be why the people who built Europe's megalithic monuments disappeared.
Number 2. The Newgrange Incest, the ruling dynasty inside Ireland's greatest monument. Ancient DNA analysis, published by Laura Cassidy and colleagues at Trinity College Dublin in Nature in 2020, produced a specific finding about the builders of Newgrange. the 5,200-year-old passage tomb in Ireland that admits a beam of winter solstice sunlight into its inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes. Approximately 4,000 years ago, the genetic ancestry of Ireland was almost entirely replaced by incoming Bronze Age populations carrying Yamnaya steppe ancestry. The people who built Newgrange are not the genetic ancestors of modern Irish people in any significant proportion. But here is where a specific detail from within Newgrange itself becomes something more than an archaeological footnote.
Among the skeletal remains interred in the burial chamber at the monument's heart, one individual showed a genetic pattern consistent with first-degree incest, a parent-sibling or equivalent close-kin relationship. The person buried in the most sacred interior space of the most significant monument in prehistoric Ireland was the product of deliberate close-kin mating. This practice is documented in royal dynasties across the ancient world, Egyptian pharaohs, Incan rulers, as a mechanism for concentrating power within a specific lineage. The evidence suggests that the society that built Newgrange had a ruling class that practiced deliberate incest to maintain exclusivity. That ruling class, and the entire genetic community it presided over, was replaced within 1,000 years of the monument's construction. The monument survived. The people who built it, and the dynasty interred at its heart, did not. Number 1. The Americas' 3 migrations. The first Americans are not who we thought. The dominant 20th century model for the peopling of the Americas was straightforward. A single population crossed Beringia from Siberia to Alaska approximately 15,000 years ago, spread southward, and diversified into all indigenous American populations. Ancient DNA accumulated since 2015 has systematically dismantled this model. A 2018 paper led by Eska Villerslev in Nature identified at least 3 genetically distinct migration waves. The first produced the ancestors of most modern Native American populations. A second produced the Na-Dene speakers of northwestern North America, including ancestors of the Navajo and Apache, arriving substantially later. A third produced Arctic populations, including the Paleo-Eskimos and Thule. More problematically, ancient DNA from Lagoa Santa in Brazil. Human remains dated to approximately 10,000 years ago shows genetic affinity with Australian Aboriginal and Melanesian populations, not present in most modern Native American groups. Multiple independent research teams have confirmed this signal. But here is where the full implication descends. A population genetically closer to modern Australians than to most Native Americans reached the tip of South America at least 10,000 years ago, and was then replaced or absorbed by later arrivals, surviving today only as fragments in ancient South American DNA. The Americas were not settled in a single event. They were settled in at least 3 waves by populations from different genetic backgrounds. The earliest Americans may have included people whose closest modern relatives live on the other side of the Pacific. These people established themselves across an entire hemisphere, and then, in most regions, vanished from the genetic record before any of it was written down. We think of the Americas as having been uninhabited until a single crossing 15,000 years ago. The DNA says otherwise, and the people the DNA points to have no name, no language we can read, and no surviving descendants we can identify with certainty. 10 findings from ancient DNA. 10 moments when a laboratory extracted information from bones and changed what we thought we knew about our species. A ghost population in the genomes of tens of millions of living West Africans with no fossil record. A 75% genetic replacement of Europe whose mechanism remains unconfirmed. Ancient Egyptian origins more complex than any single narrative accommodates. Western faces mummified at the geographical center of Asia. The most completely understood prehistoric individual whose murderer is unidentified after 5,300 years. The oldest Briton with dark skin and blue eyes. 2 Arctic populations in geographic contact for centuries with 0 genetic exchange. Plague appearing 3,000 years before the first documented pandemic in the same period as Europe's population replacement. The ruling dynasty of Newgrange practicing deliberate incest and replaced within 1,000 years. And the first Americans,
possibly including a population genetically closer to Australians than to modern Native Americans. What all 10 have in common? They make the past more like the present than we assumed, more violent in its demographic changes, more complex in its migrations, more recent in its genetic transformations, and more personal. Some of this DNA is in you. Ghost population ancestry is in West African genomes. Yamnaya ancestry is statistically probable in anyone of European descent. Neanderthal DNA is present in all non-African populations. Denisovan DNA is in Aboriginal Australians, Melanesians, and Tibetans. Ancient DNA is not the study of other people in the distant past.
It is the study of where the specific genetic combination in your body came from, through what migrations, replacements, near extinctions, and encounters between populations that never knew they were creating you. We are not at the end of these discoveries. We are at the beginning. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.